I recorded this like 2 days before the events of Charlottesville happened. And then, of course, we had to bump it because when something that huge is going down, I did feel like it needed adequate coverage, and I had something to say that most people weren't saying. So now we're back to what I would consider kind of normal business. And we get back to a very fun guest, Chris Spangle of We Are Libertarians. And I worried at the time that we talked way too much about international policy stuff, which is an area where he and I differ. And then Trump comes out and rolls out a pretty vague description of what we're planning on doing in Afghanistan. And all of a sudden, this conversation, which I worried was completely irrelevant, becomes really, really relevant based on what happened last night. And so I don't usually try to chase headlines like something happens Monday night. I don't have it on the Tuesday morning episode because that doesn't give me enough time to find an adequate guest. And it would just be almost like clickbait at that point, right? This one just worked out really, really well. Chris Spangle is a lot of fun. He has a podcast called We Are Libertarians. This is my first step into getting some other, what I would call very reputable, very interesting podcasts on. The next one we're having on is a podcast called the Trillbilly Workers Party, and they are three hyperliberals out of Kentucky that I think are a lot of fun and definitely would want to hang out with in real life if I lived by them, just like Chris of the We Are Libertarians podcast, which we're going to get into right now. All right, my name's Seth Tower Hurd. Let's be neighbors again.
And if we can't walk in love, we're a noisy little gong, a bitter little song that a bully sings out of key. And if we can't walk in peace, we'll forget about the least of these. A mother crying on her knees for a boy who's locked away. There's a voice calling me.
Chris Spangle, the podcast is called We Are Libertarians. What you said it was, what's in the intro? It's like, just a heads up, it's a podcast for adults by semi-adults. Is that how the line goes?
Yeah, it's all of the irreverence modern politics deserves. And it just sort of, that's the tagline to the podcast. And it just sort of sprang out of, about 5 years ago, a couple guys and I started a podcast, and we really just wanted to do a podcast, and it was a hobby. And over the course of time, as we started to kind of talk more about ourselves and just kind of, just shoot the stuff
that's funny. I was actually going to say, I mean, just because of kind of based on the content of your, like, I don't ask my guests really to like not be themselves, but I normally say like keep the swearing somewhere around the medium level.
Right.
Somewhere below like the mooch, James.
Yeah. Well,
let's not speculate on any acts that anybody might be doing to themselves.
Listen, yeah, no kidding. We curse on our podcast, and we talk like friends do because it's literally my friend group. We're all friends because of the podcast. And, we swear on it. And I got an email today, which is an email I probably get once a week. It's like, I'm not listening to your show anymore because A, you swear, and I came here for political topics, and I'm getting too much nonsense. And,
what? That's fine. That just means it's not for them.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And I'm kind of used to it at this point. We're not changing the formula, but yeah, I try not to swear at other people's houses though. On ours, anything goes, you can talk about whatever, but this is your podcast, and I don't know what your listener base is. I don't want to come on here and, drop the C word or anything.
Yeah. That'd be appreciated. So, first of all, it's funny how many libertarian podcasts there are out there because other podcasts like advertise on your podcast, and I had no idea until I started listening. I found you via the Bad Christian Podcast Network and thought this is a perspective we got to get on. It's such a loaded word after the 2016 election where, the term libertarian, which I would say 5 years ago, almost nobody probably had that in their political, kind of dictionary, right? And then Gary Johnson comes on the scene and it doesn't go well. There's actually this moment where everybody's going, okay, I'm ready for a third party candidate. And then Gary Johnson comes on and he's like, what's Aleppo? Which is, of course, the volatile place in Syria. And so it was kind of opportunity blown. And, yet maybe it's just because of how active people of the libertarian persuasion are on social media. But it seems like this is a bigger thing. Does it feel like that to you?
I mean, I've been involved in the libertarian movement for 10 years and in politics for 15. So, I'm so inside the bubble. It's called the curse of knowledge,
Okay.
so when you're kind of looking on the outside, so I look at like the Aleppo thing and I go, well, that was a gotcha question. Every politician gets them and he handled it poorly, but he doesn't get the forgiveness that other politicians do because everybody's looking for a reason not to make a change. Everybody wants to change, but when it comes to actually making a change, people are often not going to actually make a change. And anytime I hear somebody say, well, I'm not going to be a libertarian now because you shared a meme that has a curse word in it on Facebook, then I just reply, you were never going to be a libertarian in the first place then, so see ya. That's something that a Republican or a Democrat says just to try and create bad vibes around the word. So everybody's always I look at it, and it wasn't a blown opportunity. It was that everybody's expectations were way too high, and Gary Johnson exceeded my expectations because I'm inside the movement and go, well, he's probably going to get, I'd love for him to get 5%, but he's probably going to get 2 and double what every other libertarian presidential candidate has ever gotten. And he got 3. So,
well, and the point wasn't for him to win on the map. The point was for it to be a hung jury and then for it to be a runoff in the House of Representatives.
Yeah, but I think that was always sort of a fictional thing that was never really possible. That was just wishful thinking by a lot of new people to the political scene, and I just never thought that was really going to be something that could happen. I know that they thought that could happen, but when you're inside of a campaign, you can be realistic behind closed doors. But the libertarian movement, I mean, when I first heard the word from Neil Bortz on talk radio, and nobody talked about being a libertarian. It wasn't cool to be a libertarian. Nobody really knew what it was. I mean, the joke about, what are you, a librarian? I don't get it. That's a joke because that's literally what people said until around 2012. I mean, Gary Johnson, I ran a podcast promoting his speeches called Gary Johnson for President. It was just basically me ripping YouTube interviews that he did in 2012, and I must have posted 20 or so, less than that. I mean, I was posting 20 a week at certain points during the 2016 campaign. So in that 4 years, it's really been amazing to see the movement explode over these last few years and to really have, I mean, I wasn't at the forefront. This is a 50, 60, 70,000 year. I mean, it's a long-term movement. I mean, it's been around as a movement since 100 years ago. But the struggle for human freedom is millennia old, obviously. But as somebody who is now kind of a thought leader in the libertarian movement, it is bizarre because it's you're shouting in the wilderness, and now everybody else has a podcast too. But it's great. I mean, it is really interesting to see an idea start to be talked about and people at least wrestle with the idea. But I think by and large most people are not ready to make a change in their voting habits, but I think in their personal values they're realizing that the politics of libertarianism matches up with their personal values.
Okay. And is that, let's get into what that means in a second, but is that mean, do you see this as a losing fight in the short term then? I mean, because it's a very buzzword type thing, right? But I mean, is there one libertarian in a national congressional seat at this point? Like, because Ron Paul is retired? Or is it zero right now?
It depends on how you define libertarian. I mean, if you're an anarcho-capitalist and you live in New Hampshire, Keene, New Hampshire, and you listen to Free Talk Live every day and you're part of the Free State Project, you don't think Ron Paul or Rand Paul is a libertarian. I do. I think they are libertarians. I think that Justin Amash or Thomas Massey, who are congressmen in Kentucky and Michigan, are libertarian. You know, there are certain policies that Donald Trump holds that are libertarian. in that he wants to deregulate, that he's more non-interventionist than Hillary Clinton was. So it's a philosophy, and so politicians will always take parts of a philosophy and adapt it for themselves. And there isn't anybody who gets into the business of politics who is fully libertarian. If you're talking about the Libertarian Party, no, there are elected Libertarian Party officials, even here in Indiana where I'm at. I'm in Indianapolis, and about 30 minutes east of here, we have a person who's on a city council. We have a town east of that, a judge who's been elected 6 times, a small town judge named Susan Bell. So but it is definitely a momentum type thing.
I guess it's also sort of like, Rand Paul runs as a Republican in the way that Bernie Sanders runs as a Democrat. Bernie Sanders clearly calls himself socialist, is a socialist.
Right.
It just kind of doesn't make sense. And I wouldn't call myself a libertarian by any means. But man, back in 2013, 2014, before like the actual primaries really spun up, I love Rand Paul. Like I thought like this is going to happen. This is going to change the game. And unfortunately, you could talk about people not wanting to change their voting habits. He didn't perform. I really wanted him to, but it's kind of like I love my own governor, Scott Walker. Scott Walker stood there and got punched in the face repeatedly and was the first guy out after being promised like $1 billion from the Koch brothers or something like that, right? He just, unfortunately, being a good leader or legislator and getting elected to that position have nothing to do with each other. And both of those guys are good, but they just could not get the job done as far as getting on a stage and communicating with the American people.
Yeah, if you go back and you read the 1912 platform of the United States Socialist Party, it is like reading Barack Obama's platform. I mean, it's literally, we've come so far in 100 years, and we now have 50% of our population is drawing some revenue from either a paycheck from the government or a welfare check. And obviously the growth of Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security is a huge entitlement, and Obamacare, in my opinion, is eventually going to lead to single payer healthcare in America. Like it is very difficult to be an ideologue of any ilk and be a participant in the American political process. Politics is about compromise. Now, if you're talking about why Rand Paul failed specifically, it's not that he failed because he's an ideologue. It's that he just didn't run a good campaign. The Koch brothers wanted to meet with him, and he wouldn't cancel his vacation to go meet with the Koch brothers. The Koch brothers are 2 brothers. One ran for president in 1980, and before Gary Johnson was on a ticket in 1980 that got the highest vote total for libertarians ever. They basically have funded the Cato Institute, Reason Magazine, the Institute for Humane Studies, the Charles Koch Institute, all these major any libertarian thought that you see out there has in online, in written form, and video, comes from probably a think tank that the Koch brothers funded. They've done more for human freedom and the libertarian movement than anybody else ever has in terms of funding it and making sure that the thought is well developed. The Mises Institute always fights with them, and that's Murray Rothbard, and that's
okay. I'm going to translate a little bit of this because we're getting in the weeds where
anyways,
what we're talking about.
But I'm saying, all right, long story short, the Koch brothers have done a lot for the libertarian movement. They would be the natural supporters of Rand Paul. He wouldn't cut his vacation.
He just didn't show up. I remember that. It made me wonder if he really wanted it.
I don't think he did.
I don't think he did either. And if you go back, if you look at some of the keynotes he's done at different places, I'm like, oh my gosh, this guy is so great. You put him on a stage with other people, he can't do it. And that's where we get back to, so you're, I think maybe if I hear you saying this correctly, you're saying that, the ideals that you're trying to put out there, your goal more than to get a certain label of person elected to, a certain office is to get these ideas into the American political system in the way that the Republican Democrat labels have stuck around, but they mean something very, very different than they did 80 years ago. It means something very different than they did 15 years ago.
Yeah.
That's very interesting about the socialist handbook or whatever of 1912. I'm guessing that 0% of the audience has read that, but maybe I can link to it because
Yeah.
I'm sure it's free.
There was a guy, and sorry to cut you off in your own podcast, but this guy named Eugene Debs was from Terre Haute, Indiana, and I've studied him a little bit, and he's really where I got this, and he's one of the reasons that I left direct action politics like electioneering and working with candidates and things, and started the podcast. It's that I saw the fact that as a third party member, as an author, as somebody who stood on the outside of the Democratic Party and the left from a very radical position, he was able to move them more left and therefore the country more left to his ideals. And I think libertarians now need to do the same thing on the right and basically be the conscience of the right and move them more towards libertarian principles.
And do you feel like when you said that, there are these different people that have a very different interpretation of what libertarianism is? Let me give you one place where I feel like for sure I'm not a libertarian, right?
Okay.
Part of my extended family is from Laos, who fled because of communism, and got into refugee camps in Thailand in response to the United States. My wife is ethnically half Jewish. A lot of people that I have heard self-ascribe as libertarianism would say we shouldn't have gone into World War II and we shouldn't have gone into Vietnam. I'm not for every war ever, but I look at those two wars as being very, very connected because we won World War II and stopped the complete genocide of European Jews. We lost the Vietnam War and we could have very easily crushed North Vietnam from a military aspect, and we had the second worst genocide of the 20th century happen within Laos and Cambodia, which people I grew up with, saw children being stabbed to death with bayonets and people having their heads cut off. I'm not for every war ever by any means. I also think there's some very bad people in the world that you just have to kill, and I get it. Like kind of the libertarian thing came about and was heavily influenced by World War I. Thinking about who was vulnerable on the world stage during those two wars, I would say that probably most people that put your label on themselves would say, a lot of them would say we shouldn't have gone to World War II, which is really hard for me to wrap my head around.
Yeah, well, they're bad communicators. And that is a very real problem with libertarianism, is that many of the people who are advancing the ideas just aren't good at communicating the ideas because they're professors. They're not regular people talking. So,
and that's one of the reasons I had you on, is because I feel like there's a lot of options out there I looked at as far as who am I going to have represent this, this philosophy. And a lot of it, quite frankly, is like intellectual masterbation.
Absolutely.
It's just for themselves.
They're exactly right. Yeah. And that's what we're trying to not do. There was a book that Pat Buchanan wrote that the title's like Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War, I think it is. And he advances the idea that I think a lot of non-interventionists, sometimes called isolationists, but libertarians are not isolationists. Okay. Isolationism is North Korea. They don't trade with other countries, with the exception of China, because they have to. They're basically supplied. Everything is supplied by China, which Americans are not isolationists because we believe that our economic engine will free anyone in the world. Capitalism is the great liberator. And so we generally believe that the best way to prevent dictatorships and tyranny is by making people rich. And not the top 1%, but everybody. There's a book called The 5,000-Year Leap that Cleon Skousen, I think it is, wrote, talking about how the American government, by enshrining capitalism into its government, freed people at the rate of 5,000 years. The previous 5,000 years had been basically truncated in those 200 since the founding of the United States government. So we believe that economics are really where we ought to focus in terms of dealing with other countries. America over the last 100 years has focused its efforts not only economically but militarily. We're in 170 countries. There's like 175 countries.
Well, and I was just talking about that with somebody today. Like the fact that we're in Germany infuriates me because it's just, I mean, our allies in Western and Central Europe are so freaking stable. Right. There's no chance. Germany obviously was, one of our greatest enemies of all time, sort of like Britain. Now two of our greatest allies and the two stabilizing forces of Europe. There's no chance that there's going to be a mass scale ground invasion of Germany that we have to aid them in fighting off Russia. There's no chance. I think obviously I think Putin would freaking love to have a lot of things back. I think he'd love to have Poland back. I think he'd love to have Russia back. All the stands back.
Well, the reason that we have like a base in Germany is that it's a forward base. So we can go and on with our military interventionism in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. And you take a look at
that one's I think that's the biggest one, like Ramstein or whatever is the biggest base, and it just seems like a very large waste of taxpayer dollar.
The largest
staff it at that level.
The largest embassy in the world was built in Iraq. So you take Saudi Arabia for example. These military bases, just to get down to the nitty gritty, and then I'll kind of circle back over into interventionism in World War II. The military bases, for instance, when we said we'd free Kuwait from Saddam Hussein, but we needed to build a military base to make sure that Saddam didn't get out of trouble. We ended up building 3 military bases in Saudi Arabia. The Mujahideen, which was led by Osama bin Laden at the time, says, do not let the Americans into our Holy Land. Don't let them build bases. The Mujahideen will fight this battle for you. We'll take care of it. We're the most experienced fighting force in the Middle East. We're with you. Let us take care of it. And the Saudi Arabians said no. Let them build bases, and that's really why Osama bin Laden cited his reason for starting the 9/11 attacks was that we built bases in their Holy Land. And so the reason that we have these bases is that we are using our dollar and we are using our military to keep the world stable. And to lend this neoconservative, which is Irving Kristol, if you look up neoconservatism, this is really where it kind of started. It is basically used military threat by the greatest superpower in the world to keep everyone calm and subdued. And what really happens is a form of neocolonialism where we go in and we give access to our banks and say to these third world countries, in exchange for keeping you safe, we want access and contracts for our country's companies. They get your mine reserves, they get your oil reserves, they get your resources, and we basically have enslaved economically a lot of these countries, and that's what the World Bank does. And that just breeds all of this blowback towards Americans. And so
should we have killed Hitler?
Okay, so to go back, if you look at the entangling alliances of World War I and you really study the beginning of World War I and why it happened, and you had all these great powers, they were literally called the great powers, who were all networked together, you get this entangled alliances that once somebody goes to war, then the other party goes to war, and we're kind of back to that place where if North Korea fires a missile, it's not about North Korea. It's about America versus China, Russia. So, these third world countries are pawns. And so I believe that World War II was a just war, but it was also a preventable war. And so if you go back to the beginning of World War I, had you had a more common sense diplomatic...
Oh, absolutely. And,
and you wouldn't have had the absolute bludgeoning of the German people and the shaming of the German people. You would have never had a Hitler. And so when you have one country determining the outline, the outcome for another country, you have problems down the line, and that's why you have to fight World War II. Yeah. The Vietnam War, I don't agree that was a just war, but we can get into that in a second, but World War II was absolutely a just war. I mean, if the Japanese and the Germans had been allowed to take over the world, I mean, just look at the atrocities that they committed as they went into places like Poland. I mean, they were animals.
Yeah, well, we're getting into some very and I would argue that within Vietnam, after we left Vietnam, Pol Pot killed a quarter of the nation of Cambodia, including everyone with glasses because they might be able to read. You and I would both be dead. There's a lot there we agree with. I have also heard a lot of libertarians say that on podcasts and that type of thing, and I'm not holding you to this argument, okay? But I bring it up because I've also heard a lot of them say FDR knew we were going to get attacked, which, I mean, I don't know how you could ever know that or prove that.
I don't
FDR
think
knew we were going to get attacked, and therefore, he kind of wanted it to happen so we could get into the war. I mean, that gets pretty far into tinfoil hat world.
It does, and that's the Bush did 9/11 conspiracy. Is that Bush was so in deep with the Saudi Arabian government? They show the picture of him holding hands with the Saudi premier. Like, America did not do 9/11 just so we could get into a war to enrich Dick Cheney's friends. Like, come on.
Well, I mean, yeah, and what I always tell people, and the extreme right and the extreme left tend to fall into the same thing, where it's like kind of the Alex Jones or whatever the leftist version of Alex Jones is. If you can watch reruns of the X-Files on Netflix and be like, wow, that really matches up with my worldview. Where it's like everything is a globalist conspiracy. Like, if you watch X-Files and that was a plot in the 90s and today it's what you think, maybe you're a little on the silly side.
I mean, I will entertain these ideas. I listen to Alex Jones, but I just don't think that the government can't be both incompetent and dumb on one hand and incredibly brilliant on the other. I mean, you take something like rigging the vote. I ran into a friend last night, and I said, and he works for an election company who basically builds the machines that we vote on. And he said, if you wanted to steal the vote, you'd have to have 75 people in the town of Nashville, for instance. You'd have to have 75 people under the threat of murder, paying them off. What are the chances that eventually one of those 75 people wouldn't leak? The thousands of people that went into 9/11, none of those people have leaked at this point. None of those,
that's, like, I'm a film and TV critic, which is not the heaviest hitting journalism ever, right?
Yeah.
I'm not acting like I broke Watergate. However, I've done national. I mean, I've hosted a music interview show that was syndicated nationally. I've been on an American Idol knockoff cable show. Again, that was national and international. I've booked people on every TV station in Chicago for PR stuff. I've broken stories into CNN, Sports Illustrated, Fox Sports. Those were fluff stories, okay? So it wasn't like I was breaking hard news.
Sure.
And whenever people's like, oh yeah, there's a global media conspiracy, I'm like, okay, I can draw you an outline of how that's not possible. I think that without a doubt, overall, there is a very, very strong left leaning to the media. And because of that, you're going to see a lot of the same kind of messaging. But the idea that somehow it's organized and, there's a villain from a Bond movie that's sitting there in a high back leather chair, just like pulling the levers. And no, what you're getting is a lot of the same kinds of stories because of the same kind of editors and gatekeepers, but they are not synced up in any way.
Yeah. It's the idea of spontaneous order. It's like, why do ducks fly in a V? Did somebody sit down and teach those ducks how to do that? No, they just instinctually do that. And I think that humans have many of the same tendencies because we are animals. And you look at something like Trump, for instance. I think the rejection of Nixon and Trump, it is like the collective. Nobody's getting together and deciding like these guys are authoritarian jerks that we need to expel out of American politics because they go against our values. People may articulate that, but there isn't one grand designer going, get Trump out of office. It's just he's such he rings all the bells of a tyrant that the American population just goes, get him out, get him out, get him out, like fighting a cancer cell. I think that we as human beings we want to like to ascribe, we just can't handle the fact that like there may be chance or fate or spontaneous order. Like there has to be some grand plan. I don't know why.
Even in and then I'm going to get like a couple one-word answers or one-sentence answers. We're going to move on.
Right.
But even in the way that we cover politics, like there has to be a narrative to it. When a lot of things there's just not a narrative on. There's just facts. Like there is no. I mean, the mainstream media have kind of fallen into the same thing where. I'm not saying it's a conspiracy, but what I would say is it's like the BuzzFeedification of things.
Yeah.
To where they have to kind of find a dumber through line to keep people paying attention, basically. Okay, you don't think Vietnam was just get into that, and then we're going to move on to another topic, and I won't respond because we got to keep going.
Again, it's the domino theory, and going into the Gulf of Tonkin, for instance, was absolutely set up. If you look into the history of the Gulf of Tonkin, it was either a conspiracy to get us into the war, or it was just.
Wait, can you unpack that? Because I mean, you're really smart, dude, and I'm following you a lot, but I don't think a lot of people have had the time to read as deeply into like 20th century history as you have.
All right, thank you.
So give it a 15-second setup, okay?
I appreciate it. The Gulf of Tonkin was this attack by the Vietnamese. We had soldiers in Vietnam at that point. And there was 2 attacks. There was one legitimate attack, and then there was a false report of a second attack. And the Johnson administration used that second attack to basically spur us into war. And it was McNamara, who was the defense secretary at the time, later, 20, 30 years later, said, yeah, we just messed up. And so the escalation into Vietnam was under false pretenses from the very beginning. And what did we really accomplish? By going into Vietnam and destabilizing it, you end up with a Pol Pot. And that's so a lot of times people
sorry, I said I wasn't going to argue back. Finish it. And then
a lot of times people will use your argument that if you don't stop Hitler, it's like, well, but let's go back 40 years and look at the way that all of this led, how this all, it's all dominoes. You've got to go back in time and learn those lessons, and we've just not learned those lessons, and Vietnam was just another example of us not learning the lesson about interventionism.
I would say that in theory, overall, we agree. We probably disagree on that point. Let me ask you one other question about foreign policy, and then let's move on.
Sure.
One of my libertarian friends just said that this was the dumbest thing ever. And obviously some of a lot of the weapons we supplied to Afghanistan in the 1980s to defeat the Soviet Union. We were not an active player in the war, but we financially supported Afghanistan. One of my libertarian friends came back and just said, well, this is dumb. Like, how can you think that it's okay to have supported them? And I said, because Russia killed 3 to 4 times as many people in Poland as died defending Afghanistan. And I think what those tribesmen pulled off in the 1980s to defeat one of the greatest military powers in the world and maintain their sovereign homeland is a stunning upset in the history of the world. What the Russians were doing to that country, totally, I mean, people come in, rape, burn, murder, and pillage, and you fight back. I think that's, that is the definition of a just war, right? Like, you are literally fighting for the lives of your family and your homeland. We supplied arms and money, and then later, obviously, we got into a war with Afghanistan under very different circumstances, and you can certainly argue about the effectiveness of us being there in the first place. Would you say that intervening in anything usually winds up going bad, or are there examples where you'd say it wound up going well?
I can't think of an example where it went well, especially in modern history. Charlie Wilson's War was a movie that you can watch that it basically details exactly what you're talking about. And there's a scene on the balcony at the end where they're like, well, we'll see. We'll see how this turns out. And it basically is foreshadowing the rise of Al-Qaeda. If you look at ISIS, there's a photo of John McCain meeting with Syrian freedom fighters who were fighting the evil Assad. Those 2 gentlemen that John McCain posed with in 2012, 2013, went on to be one of the founders of ISIS. In Syria right now, ISIS fighters are driving brand new American-made Toyota trucks made right here in Indiana because we gave them to them. Well,
at least Trump kept is keeping his promise on trade or exporting.
That's part of what happened at Benghazi. Benghazi was a CIA post where they were running guns to Syria, and they became under attack, and that's why nobody really talks about it, is because it was illegal gun running by the United States government. So if you look at modern times, there really isn't an example where us intervening in other people's affairs has worked well for the United States or for the populations. What ends up happening is we just end up flooding a zone with the best made weapons in the world, and that seems completely counterintuitive. So if you look at the guns in Syria that are left on the battlefield, it's Russia and America. And Russia is supplying guns because we're supplying guns, so we supply guns because Russia's supplying guns. It's just a circle that is ludicrous. And as both a Christian and a libertarian, I don't believe in killing, and I don't believe in war, and I don't like that my tax dollars are being used to fund to gas and kill children.
Let's move on to domestic stuff, if that's cool. And this is all. I mean, you're definitely one of the most well-read people I've had on, so I really would love for you to send me some notes, because nobody's going to catch the. I mean, this like all these books and studies are going by so fast.
I'm sorry. Again, it's what I mentioned earlier, the curse of knowledge, and I appreciate you going, hey, can you talk to me like, listen, I know what you're talking about, but everybody else, let's just pretend I'm a baby, okay?
Okay. So let's get into domestic stuff. And this is where, forgive me again, I'm going to use the term intellectual masturbation. But this is where I see stuff that I agree with, as far as like the size of the government's like way too large. And then I also see people that are, quote unquote libertarians are like, oh, privatize all police, privatize all roads. And I'm just going, yeah, that's probably not going to work out real well.
Right.
I would say that I'm definitely looking for a smaller government, but there are certain things that that I think a government is set up to do well. And overall, I do like the interstate. I might not like it around Chicago, but overall, I think that's a pretty good system. So that's where, I have never ascribed to the label, even though there's several things I like. Obviously, we differ on some foreign policy stuff for sure. But I also have never known what to do with this. Like, oh, well, if we could just privatize the roads, it would be awesome. And I mean, that's just not. If you want to get practical political action done for your idea, for your ideas, like, so if you're trying to move the ball on things that can really move in the United States, walking around saying let's privatize the roads, all it does is like screw up the rest of your arguments, because you go from somebody who's kind of like, hey, you know what, that's an interesting combination of things, the whole libertarian thing, to, okay, these people are just like, they're just sort of like college nerds playing Dungeons and Dragons with conceptual ideas.
We call them Liberty LARPers on our show. We actually have a term for it. We call them Liberty LARPers. And you are peeking into movement conversation and deducing that is just what all libertarians believe in some ways. And I'm not blaming you, because that's what most people do. And there's a vacuum of people who are talking about current events, because it's hard to talk about current events. It's hard to read books and study on this stuff. My co-host Greg Lenz and I, he spends at least 15 hours a week just reading for show prep for the show. And I do as much as I can. I mean, which
is probably 5 to 6 to 7 times what the average American read. I mean, isn't it like 15 to 20% of college graduates never read another book?
Yeah, I mean,
and so college graduates.
And then we get emails like 2 hours is too long for a show. It's like, we're trying to distill this down to
how much Netflix do you watch if 2 hours is too long to be informed in the world?
Yeah. So I totally get what you're saying. Like I have talked to some of the best libertarian minds on our show and had them try to explain private courts to me so I can become a cool anarchist like the rest of the kids. And I can't get there. And I think what happens is that the most revered, the ones with the highest social proof in the movement are all anarchists. And so these young libertarians get in and go, I want to be cool like them, instead of sitting there trying to, they don't think for themselves. And libertarians are just like every other political movement. They have just kind of bandwagon people. And so I drive on roads. I have 100 library books checked out. I go to the library every single day. I love the library. I use it. I pay my taxes. I don't like that I pay my taxes, but I do. And so there is just a lot of bad messaging, and that's kind of what you're picking up on.
Yeah. Well, and we're both Christians. It's kind of hard because if somebody who doesn't really have any interest in Christianity, if they get kind of dry by Christianity, they probably get Joel Osteen, or they get some kind of scandal.
Sure.
I'm like, okay, my life looks kind of nothing like either one of those things.
Right. It's exactly the same. It's like I get frustrated in the way that a Christian gets frustrated when, all Christians are bad. Look at Tammy Faye Baker, to use a dated reference. It's like, or some cult. You can't say that every Christian believes the exact same thing because Jim Baker or Pat Robertson says some dumb stuff on TV. Like it is infuriating that you kind of get distilled down to just whatever that person sees in the movement, and it's that lack of critical thinking that is shown by most people, and on both ends of that equation. The person who's the libertarian doesn't think like maybe this person's not ready. They're thinking about what they want because they're 5 years down the rabbit hole, as opposed to thinking like, what would they want? It's basic marketing. It's like you don't shove a product down somebody's throat that they don't want to buy.
Yeah. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, is because I really try to push the audience or encourage the audience. I subscribe to 60 podcasts.
Sure.
I've got you guys on my feed as one of them. And it kind of depends on the week, right? So I'm a pretty big UFC fan. There was just a huge event. So I'm consuming a lot of that content. When that goes a little more quiet, then I kind of jump over to something else. I mean, there's stuff in there about the Christian faith. I've got stuff on, on politics. I've got stuff on business, and then I've got just kind of entertainment stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And I kind of swim in and out of those streams. So that's how I'm able to subscribe to 60 podcasts. I always tell people, you need to understand what other people think, even if it's just to better understand why you believe what you believe. So, Ben Shapiro on the right, I think, is a very well thought out individual. Pod Save America on the left, I think, just as far as entertainment value, those are both very like funny, relevant, reference a lot of pop culture. Don't wear tinfoil hats. I would put you guys in there because you guys are a lot of fun with what you're doing, right?
Thank you.
And so I would encourage people to go ahead and check out your podcast, just because you guys are freaking hilarious and you're really a blast to hang out with. And, with this podcast, I always tell people, I don't expect you to listen to every episode. I put 2 a week out. I want it to be there for when you're ready to listen to it, that there's something that's relevant to you. And it's cool if you don't listen to every episode. That's not this isn't radio. I'm not trying to get you by the quarter hour. I was in Chicago radio for 10 years. I'm just trying to make good things. My wife and I are going to the beach here in a couple minutes. So unfortunately, I mean, we hit way more international than I meant to. I meant to be more domestic, but that's okay. Give me a rundown on the way you would like things to be run domestically. I know that's a huge topic, but if you can give me 5 minutes on that, and actually, I think I'd really love to do this again sometime when you can.
Absolutely.
Let's do it, in 3 or 4 months or something like that, because there's so much we didn't get to. But just if you could do more of I would say what a workable libertarian thing is, as opposed to just like dudes that are in some subreddit that are just going off about private courts. So why don't you go for that?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to talk about the libertarian vision of what that would look like without scaring people. But if you're talking about,
well, let's just talk about let's put it this way, okay? If you could move everything that's the most important to you 5 to 10% in your direction, what would that look like? Like, what would kind of some small changes that could actually get legislated under the right Congress look like?
Gotcha. First things first, election reform. We live in a digital world, and a guy announced for the Indiana Senate today named Todd Rokita. He's a friend of mine. He's a really good guy. He, in 2009, introduced this plan called Rethinking Redistricting to redraw the maps around basically computer-drawn maps as opposed to politician-drawn maps. And he ended up getting put on the back bench and was hated by every state legislator because he had the gall to introduce electoral reform. And so it's not good for anybody. No, it is the most important thing that we can do as Americans is in gerrymandering, have computers that are uninterested draw our maps so we can bring back competition to elections. We would immediately cripple the industry of overspending, because what happens in Indiana, for instance, there are only like 5 or 6 legislative seats that are actually competitive, and no congressional seats that are competitive. And so all the money gets sunk into these because they collude every 10 years to share resources. And so by redrawing the maps in a responsible way, you're going to get much better government, much less ideological, extremist government. You're going to get less money in politics. You're going to get more people who like us running for politics. It is by far the most important thing that we can do.
Okay. What else? Just as closing, man, I wish we would have done this for the whole time. But you know what? I think that I'd love to get you back on in a month or something like that if you got time.
Yeah,
because it seems like you're spilling over with knowledge. I don't edit the episodes. I put out 2 a week, so they are what they are. Sure. Let's hit on a couple more. And I'm going to preview this in the intro, like how key the end of this interview is.
Okay.
A couple more things like that, and we'll pick up this conversation in September.
Give me a topic.
What is your ideal tax rate and why?
0.
What is a tax rate you think you could get through Congress if there are more seats going in your direction and there were a favorable president?
The first thing I would do is end corporate taxes. Business taxation is double taxation. If I go and spend $1 at Target later, I am paying them. They are then paying taxes on the dollars that have already been taxed by me. So into that double taxation, you completely revive the economy. You get way more jobs than we can handle, and that would be the first step that I would end or drastically reduce corporate taxes. I would also cut American income taxes. We didn't have the income tax till 100 years ago in 1913, and it was
and things were fine.
It was like 7%, and they were like, it will never go higher than 7%. By the 60s, it was 96% when John Kennedy cut it. And when John Kennedy cut it, you had rapid expansion of the economy. Same thing in the 80s. Tax cuts don't just go to the wealthy; they go back to the entire economy. So that, again.
Well, let me ask this as a follow-up.
Sure.
So this almost doesn't even seem like a relevant question in a nation of Republicans and Democrats, because we've seen since the year 2000, apparently nobody gives a crap about the national deficit except for Mitt Romney, who was dead right.
Right.
So I don't even think anybody cares about cutting anything. They just like to spend, and they're like, whatever, we'll borrow it. What would you cut to be able to get the tax rate down to that? And let's go out on that note. Just a real quick summary.
I would cut our military first and foremost. I would start scaling back and bringing. We spend more on the military than every other nation combined on Earth, and so when people are worried about the North Koreans, remember that. I would start there, and I would also end a ton of departments. The education department, for instance, since it was introduced in the 70s, absolutely zero impact in the improvement of scores, and has only brought about the age of standardized testing, which has absolutely destroyed American education. And so I would start cutting a lot of these departments that just pass regulations that cripple businesses.
Chris Spangle, it's truly been a delight. We could do a 3-hour show like you guys do, but I can't. So we'll call it September. Give me a whole bunch of notes, because I really do think that people who listen to this podcast actually have a shot at going and reading some of this stuff, not all of it, because it was an overwhelming amount of information, and that's good. But maybe you could pick 1 or 2 things to put on your reading list. We Are Libertarians, the podcast, obviously. You can download that wherever you get podcasts. Anything else you think people know about, how to connect with you?
Yeah, go to wearelibertarians.com, and you can connect with me personally there on Twitter or Facebook on the sidebar, and just subscribe to the podcast. I mean, I try not to rant and filibuster as much on that show, but so I apologize for that. But I hope that people learn something, and that we're just trying to find solutions and give people a different look at American politics and society and culture too. We don't just talk about politics.
So if you've been wondering where the heck is that third podcast that you're on, because I'm on this one, I'm on the Jim Fannin Show with one of the top mental success coaches in the world. A bunch of pro athletes use his stuff. He's fantastic. Fannin, the Jim Fannin Show. The third podcast is called The Consultant and the Millennial, and Yeah, I submitted to iTunes. It took them like 3 weeks to get the stupid thing up, and now the name's wrong, so I had to get a hold of them about that. So if you search for it, you can't even find it. However, I'm just going to put the entire thing here, and episode 2 will be out this coming Friday. If you like it, you can search my name, Seth Tower Heard, and you'll see that there are now 2 podcasts that that I'm on. It's the same kind of picture as on this podcast, only there's like another person on it. So I'm just going to run the episode in its entirety because honestly, why not? If you don't like it, you can just hit stop. If you do like it, well, keep going. Here we go.
This is the podcast between an old school mentor and a digital mentee on managing and/or working with people, navigating a career, growing profits, and not killing your coworkers along the way. Now let's join the consultant, Haydn Shaw, and the millennial who fixes Hayden's iPhone, Seth Tower Heard.
Hey, welcome to episode 0. It's a little rough. I'm making sure I've got the title we landed on. Did we wind up on the consultant and the millennial? Is that where we landed?
Yeah, I thought that was great.
Okay, there we are. Welcome to the consultant and the millennial, the podcast between an old school mentor and a digital mentee on managing, working with people, navigating a career, growing profits, and not killing your coworkers along the way. My name's Seth Tower Heard, serial entrepreneur, former major market broadcaster, and a guy that got a text message in August of 2015 that just said, hey, call me about social networking. I got a book coming out. And I don't even know if you put your name on it.
I probably didn't put my name on it because, only people who understand what to do on their phone would know to put your name on a text message. So, yeah, shut up.
And then it kicked off one of the most beneficial and important relationships in my life and career that started with me driving an hour and a half to teach Haydn how to put Skype on his laptop and his Microsoft Surface.
That's right, so I could do an interview.
So you could, because I set up all these podcast interviews for you, and you're like, wait, where does this thing go? And so that's how we came together, and we would start having these conversations, and I would be going, man, like I really wish my friends could hear this. Like they could really, really benefit from just like the wisdom that Haydn throws away and doesn't even realize he has. People would be dying for when they're facing problems in their careers. So if I can just set you up a little bit here, my friend, you have helped Microsoft, the Atlanta Falcons, Bayer, the medical company, BP, Edward Jones, Hyatt Hotels, on the nonprofit and international side, World Vision, the international nonprofits, and companies like Banco Nacional in Costa Rica work through essentially their people and management problems. And you got into this whole thing because you had some guy just totally throw you under the bus, and you're like 23 years old, right? Didn't he just say, well, you basically just can't trust these young kids to get anything done? Was that more or less the sentiment that drove you towards consulting?
That was what got me interested in both the generational topic, because he thought generational stuff was completely an excuse for lazy young people to rationalize away why they wouldn't work like he did. And I realized that, hey, management was a lot bigger part of nonprofit world than what I was told when I was in my master's. And so I started reading management books like crazy just to survive. So between those two things, those two jobs, I started becoming a fan.
And so you went into this, you've been in front of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people talking through management, and specifically generational stuff as of late has been like a really big thing. Is I was referred to the other day as a gray-haired millennial because I'm 34, and so like because you said there's like old, middle, and young millennials, right?
There are 18-20 years, it gives you a lot of room. And so what you grew up with isn't quite the same thing as what my 20-year-old daughter is, growing up with, the things that shaped her. And I'm not just talking about technology. One episode we'll talk about that. Everybody thinks, oh, it's technology that changes it. No, the most important research is on generations. It's not technology at all that shapes a generation. It's technology that accelerates generational characteristics and value shifts that are already there. Technology is not what determines a generation, because every generation has had different technology than the one before it. So that's one of the big myths of generations. That's another topic, another day.
Okay. By the way, this is episode 0, so we're just totally shooting from the hip. We'll be back in a week with episode number 1 with one of the top young CEOs in the country on building a company culture that attracts and retains people. And somebody that interviewed me didn't hire me. I wrote a very nasty letter about the interview process, so we wound up being friends. So that's.
And by the way, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that for your career development. Yeah,
telling off a company that doesn't hire you.
Yeah, right. Yeah, but so that's not an official recommendation, but it worked for Seth.
My mom would tell me always growing up, like, don't burn a bridge, don't burn a bridge. I found that I'm both better at burning things and somehow reconstructing them out of the ashes.
Yeah, that's great.
Than the average Joe. So we're going to get into 6 pieces of information here that can help you as we just shoot from the hip from episode number 1 here. So it's the 6. What was the list again?
Oh, it's the 6 problems your organization, company has to solve if it's going to be solvent in the next 10 years.
Okay. So let's go ahead and dive into it. And I don't actually know all these, so go for it. What's the first piece we're working with here?
Okay, so we're talking about kind of what's the cutting edge in generations, what we're focused on with this list. So there's certain generation problems organizations are going to have to solve going forward. So I'd say the last 10 years that I've been primarily focused on generational differences in the leadership and management work and coaching that I do, and the books that I've written, having to post articles, all that stuff. It's been as much about the millennials are here, let's interpret them, let's break through the stereotypes, let's use real research and data, instead of you heard somebody who met somebody who heard about a millennial who did this. And now you've got 80% of the millennials saying, we're not like those other 20% who also drive us crazy. Simon Sinek does a video that goes viral where he basically explains the millennials by saying their parents messed them up. Companies, you're just going to have to learn to live with them. See, millennials, it's not your fault. And the millennials just were like, what are you doing, dude? That's not helping. And so there was a lot of backlash to that video, and a lot of older generations went, that's so true. Anyway, we've done this whole awareness thing for 10 years, and most people are aware that the millennials are here. Some of them are starting to get a little gray and, settling down into the next stage of life. And so what are the questions that people are asking? What are the things that people are going to have to do? And generational stuff is no longer optional because the millennials are now reshaping organizations just like the Xers did.
Which, by the way, episode 2, it's literally like about as millennial company as you could possibly have. Like the movie stereotypes, only in a good way. Happy medium out of Des Moines, Iowa is what who we're going to have next, and they are just, they millennial so hard the wheels are going to fall off, and they're killing it. They're they're growing like crazy because of it.
Well, and more. Today, we would say, all of the generational characteristics that made boomers and traditionalists mad when the Xers first came into the job market. Fortune magazine's got one of them on the cover in '93, making basically going, they're bizarre. Everything that the Xers came along and demanded has slowly moved into the way we do things. So today, none of that stuff even surprises us because we adjusted. And 20 years from now, we'll be saying the next thing about the next generation, and the millennials would have reshaped the world. Point of it is, since millennials are the major part of your future workforce, your managers say the wrong thing to them. You got to solve that problem. Your managers say the wrong thing far more often than they realize. And you don't even know what ticks your millennials off and why they go work for companies like Happy Medium, allergies, and help them grow rapidly. Your millennials don't want to stay. Many of them are staying. More of them don't want to stay. You can't hire good ones. Now, some of the organizations may be doing okay hiring good ones. They do have to work someplace. Their parents finally say, here's what you're going to have to do. But in terms of hiring the really good ones, they talk on blogs about what they want, and it's often not the blogs on Glassdoor, and it's often not what what large organizations are offering. And I just got an email from a guy in a blue collar kind of company, manufacturer company. He said, we can't even hire him. We go to job fairs and they won't even talk to us. So your book didn't help me because you actually have to have some before sticking points helps. So what do we do? And so it's becoming a bigger and bigger problem, transferring knowledge. The boomers are leaving, and most organizations are transferring knowledge like they did 25 years ago. And we're talking about completely different species. Your organization makes decisions in a way that favors hierarchy instead of group participation. And you think you may have changed because you ask people's opinions before you tell them what you're going to do. But most organizations haven't made significant shifts in their decision-making process, and that's a huge barrier to moving forward. And ironically, you don't fire fast enough. You've got some new employees, and the only way they're going to be worth something is to be fired more quickly than you're firing. You're too nice because your managers don't know what to do, and HR is a little worried they're going to get in trouble.
You know, and you had to walk me through that with my own company, where it was I'd picked up somebody who'd been through a season of unemployment for a project manager position on a freelance gig to see how it was going, and I don't think she wanted to stay with me at all. And I was like, man, she's terrible. But and I have a hard time turning her out on the street. It's like, well, maybe she'll get a little better. Maybe she'll get a little better. And you just kept saying, fix your hiring decision faster. There's nothing you're going to do to pull this thing out. Like she just doesn't have the skill set. She's rude to your other employees, and you can endure that for a little while. But the number one reason people leave their leave any job because they don't like their boss. Probably the number two reason is because they get sick of cleaning up after idiots. I mean, that's anecdotal data, but I mean, we
no,
all
you know what? That'd be my observation. I've coached about 30,000 managers through the years, and I think that's accurate. I'll give you one more. People lie. It catches up with them. If you're a person that isn't doing anything, isn't producing anything, it takes between 6 months and 18 months, depending on the nature of the job, for people to catch you. And I've run into some people who had employees like that person who really wasn't doing anything. And because they worked remotely and virtually on projects, it was hard to tell until you found out from the clients that things weren't getting managed. And so suddenly, you don't know right off the bat. And so sometimes people have to quit because they are running from their lack of results. And it's kind of, they switch to another job before they really get busted.
You know what? I'm pointing four fingers back at myself here, okay? Because I did the same thing with my own company. I met with potential client and walked them through some of the website issues of why they weren't converting, right? And the business owner told me, I think my IT guy's ripping me off. Okay, well, fire him right now. Like, I will wait. Go fire him, and maybe we'll go get a good lunch so you can feel a little bit like he's downstairs. Go do it. And it's so easy when it's not you to pull the trigger on that. It's like, well, I mean, if I don't know what he's doing, that's right. And so it's easier. It can't be replaced. And it's like, no, just do it.
No, it's easier with IT because now that in that guy's area of technical specialization, he would have known exactly how to fire because he would have known the conversation to have. But to those of us old school, non-digital native people, IT seems something close to a shaman magic or having a dragon of your own in Game of Thrones. And so people with dragons, what do I know whether or not you're doing a good job? You have your own freaking dragon.
So bottom line, if you want to keep your good employees, particularly millennials, you got to cycle through the ones that are not doing the job. You got to get them out of there. And I found that firing somebody is sort of like ending a romantic relationship. It's just the first one's going to be hard, and after you've done 3 or 4, you got to be okay. I mean, you're going to be terrified the first few times you do it. If you haven't been in that position where it's like, HR has always done it for you or something like that. If it's you for the first time, you just got to, practice your little speech, bring them in, and let them know and get them out of there so they can process.
That's right. The absolute best thing you can do for a lot of folks is to help them go work someplace else. so that they say, oh, this is not good, because they get by with it and they know it's not good, but because nobody's calling them on it, they think, well, I guess it's okay. And one of these days we can talk about this. Your floor sets the performance of the entire organization more than your ceiling. So the single fastest way you can increase performance in an organization is to fire underperformers, because it raises everybody between 5 to 20% in productivity, because they now have a new floor. The lowest performing person in every organization is the performance floor. And if you have some people that ought to be fired, my IT guy's ripping me off, everybody else uses that IT person as their baseline for how low they can go before they're truly a jerk. And you need to raise the floor, and you'll raise everyone's performance.
So somebody who would be average thinks, I can sneak an hour of Netflix in an hour every afternoon because this IT guy just keeps saying he's quote unquote updating the website. He's literally doing nothing. He's reselling stuff on eBay. And I know he's doing it, and the boss doesn't know he's doing it. So, well, I guess I ought to match the level of performance.
You know what? And Seth, people with integrity, people who have, some work ethic and some character to them, they won't do that. They won't do an hour of Netflix. They might, but here's how they rationalize it with integrity. Here's what they say. I don't do that every day like the IT person does. I only do it when I'm tired, or I only do it when
I need to reset because I'm not being creative.
People in marketing were being jerks to me. It was a nasty meeting, and I just need some me time. And I don't do what they do. And so you suddenly set a very low barrier, and they use that person. So basically, you only get the performance you want on the days when they haven't fought at home, they've had a good night's sleep, they're feeling great, and the line at Starbucks was not too long.
And there was no red lights.
There were no red lights. So you get the performance you think you're paying for 2 days a week, and because that bottom performer sets a standard so much lower that everyone has a rationalization. Even the people of higher integrity can rationalize their lower energy or their lower performance as, well, at least I'm not them. And so you literally raise all boats by raising the tide of what the minimum standard is. And I helped one organization identify the 10 lowest performers. And it sounds so horrible, but we just started one at a time. Start with the lowest and work your way up. And they literally doubled. They got to went from $500,000 to $1 billion in sales in 5 years.
Holy
and
cow.
Half of that was that they dealt with their lower performers.
So you can think of this as like fantasy baseball in reverse.
Yes.
Let's play a game where we get the managers together and draft our 10 biggest idiots.
Well, you know what? That's exactly what it is, and you can see it in teams. You get a top flight player, and then people begin to believe that they get some hope. Now, I know. Nobody in Miami is going to like it after I say this, but when Cleveland was a beautiful team for people like me who were Bulls fans, because you were guaranteed 2 wins. Every time you played them, you'd get a win. And, they're like, hey, I'm a professional player. I'm a professional ball player, even though I know I wouldn't start on other teams. You draft LeBron and people get hope, and then suddenly you start raising the minimum standards, and people start seeing that, hey, this is not acceptable anymore. And it takes a couple of seasons, and you turn the team around. And so you got to have hope. What happens is managers after a while don't believe there's anything else we can do. They lose hope. If you don't have hope, you're done. So LeBron gave hope to Cleveland and to the team. And once there's hope, then you can raise the lower standards. If managers can't look it in the eye and go, we can do this, then they don't have any reason to give people, they don't believe it enough to push. When managers lose hope, they don't push hard enough, and they let the standard set themselves.
So let me recap the story you just told, right?
Yep.
Company you were working with. The fact that they wouldn't get rid of 10 people who didn't need to be there.
Well, they actually, in a plan of 500, they had about 25, but keep going.
Okay, so 25. It was costing them $250,000.
It was costing them $250 million.
$250 million.
Now, there were some other things that had to happen. One of them was they got one of the best presidents in terms of just raw management talent and intuition I've ever worked with. I mean, he just knew what to do with the ball. He was kind of the equivalent of LeBron James. And I know everybody doesn't get one of those, but because he came in and gave people hope, he pulled that executive leadership team up to a new standard. And then the best performers in the company began to go, yeah, we're going to do something instead of decline year after year. And the lower performers then became nasty, mean, because they were fighting for their lives. It was Game of Thrones down on the shop floor. And then as we slowly gave courage, they needed an outsider to be able to reinforce what the president was doing and to say, all right, who's your absolute most destructive person? And after 20 years of having the inmates run the asylum, they began to backbone up and deal with it. It's a long story about why they ended up in that place. They wanted to be able to fire those, but in order to keep it from being union, to keep it non-union, they thought they had to roll over and play dead. And so happens. And they just began to deal with the worst one, the most egregious one, because the secret to firing is making sure that the other employees see it as fair. If you fire somebody and the other employees don't believe it's fair, the other employees will lower their performance. The other employees have to buy into a firing. That's the tricky part to firing. And so take the most obvious one and deal with it, and people are then relieved, and they began to get the hang of it. I remember about 6 months in, they said, okay, can we make a new list? Because this is great.
Okay. Last week we come
I had to calm them down a little bit. It's like, okay, good. Now that you have a taste for blood.
Well, let me speak to both sides of the issue. I've been fired. I've been laid off. I've had to end people's employment for performance issues, right? Especially in 2017, the economy's good. It's not that huge of a deal. It really isn't. Like getting, you're going to learn something about yourself. You're maybe going to get a different skill set. You are not ending anybody's life. You're making the best decision for everybody. The people who stay are going to be happier. The person who's not any good at it, you can't hold their hand for the rest of their lives. So you might as well rip the Band-Aid off. Unless you're willing to have them move into your basement and feed them and, make sure they pay their cell phone bill on time and make them a functional adult child. You can't hold their hand for the rest of their lives. So go ahead and just do it. Let's run through the rest of these simply because it's Saturday and I'm going to the beach. So go for it.
Yeah, well, I don't live by a beach, and so you suck. Your managers say the wrong things.
So what does this look like for?
What's that mean? It means that many managers said this way to me. I don't know what to do with younger millennials. I finally figured out millennials your age, but I don't know what to do with younger millennials. And because they say the wrong thing, thinking they're communicating well, they're thinking, I'm pretty good with younger people. I got nephews. I'm pretty good with you. These are the things they say when you interview their folks. They're like, oh yeah, you know what? They're trying really hard, but it's the equivalent of not knowing you need to put your name on a new text message.
Okay.
To your point earlier, and so there's just a lot of little things like that. That if you don't fit, whoever fixes them first wins. And now it's you're going to decline if you can't keep and hire and motivate the right folks. And as a result, people don't want to stay. There's some things that organizations have to do to cut their generational turnover in half, and they can do them. You can't control everything that cuts turnover, but you can cut generational turnover fairly quickly. And as a result, we can't hire the good ones. Some of that in manufacturing is ironic because manufacturing is what these manufacturing jobs are going. Most manufacturing companies are the ones that are struggling the most to find people who are reliable, who show up and do a good job.
If I can jump in right there, this is a different issue. And, probably we're not going to have nearly as many people in manufacturing as the other industries listening to the podcast. However, just had lunch with a good friend this week, who's in cold storage warehousing. And he said to me, my employee base is Eastern European immigrants and Latin American immigrants. And if policy changes like it's changing, he's like, I just don't know. I don't know what we're going to do. I don't know how we're going to staff this thing. That that's kind of like what everybody's going through right now, because white collar workers are tough to get a hold of, just like blue collar workers are in a good
Well,
economy.
Seth, so Japan had this happen, and that's what led to lean manufacturing. Toyota started lean manufacturing because their Xers did not want to work in manufacturing. They saw it as a step down. There wasn't any, as I say to clients, there's nothing to brag about when you're having a beer with your friends after work. And so,
Yeah, well, I put a mirror on really well today. It's like, yeah,
yeah. Well, that's right. But so I'm talking to National Foundry Society, and they're like, hey, we can't get people who can reprints and weld. Well, the average person the average business major gets out of college making 44 to 48 a year, depending on where you live. The average person who can weld and read a print starts at 75,000 and can get a job anywhere. And so they're like, we can't. And Mike Rowe's been making a big deal about this, but online. But the point is, we can't find somebody to do it because they don't want to tell their friends, well, I'm a welder. And they said, we've been trying to make it look at all the money, look how wonderful it is. I'm like, no. You need to do just the opposite. You need to show sparks flying in your videos. They said, yeah, we do that because that is pretty cool. You got to show a lot of fire, and then you basically say to them, you are the alchemists of the new world, and not everybody can handle it. The Marines get a sword because the Marines are harder. Not everybody can handle this. We pay a lot of money, and you'll always have a job because most people can't hack it. They said, it's funny. That's what Germany's doing with these kind of positions. They're basically saying most people are too big of babies to handle this, but if you got the chops, we got the money, and it's an amazing career. Point is, there are ways to go after folks. But most people don't know why the people they're talking to won't talk to them at a trade show or at a job fair. They don't know why, so they're guessing. Anyway, I know we got to get moving. Knowledge transfer. Boomers are leaving this time for real. There's been 2 times when people are like, oh, we're losing our boomers. We got to do knowledge transfer. And then a recession comes along and the boomers quit retiring. But the boomers are finally old enough now that the oldest boomers are getting close to 70. They're like, dude, I'm done. I don't care if I don't have as much money in the bank as I thought I would have after these recessions. I'm done. And so the boomers are really retiring this time for real, and the knowledge is going out the door with them. And when the recessions hit, organizations are like, we're not spending the money on all this knowledge transfer. Problem is, we're still doing knowledge transfer like we did 25 years ago, with older employees pulling up a younger employee and putting their arm around their shoulder and passing on stories. And as a result, 3/4 of the organizations admit that they're in real trouble with knowledge transfer. They're going to lose business, and they're going to lose know-how, and it's going to go to some younger firms where people figure out how to scoop it up.
And so what did you and I look at myself at 34, and this is what so much I've done with you is text you. What the heck do I do with this person? What the heck do I do with this situation? It seems like younger employees actually do really want it. And like, yeah, how do we fix that? Right? Like, how do you fix this in your company? Because I've heard it said both ways. I've heard some companies like, well, nobody's invincible here. We'll go on without anybody. And it's like, well, that's true, but it might take you 3 or 4 or 5 years to get somebody ready for this. Then I've also heard it like, oh my gosh, well, if this person ever wasn't here, like we don't know what we would do. People do.
Well, the reality is, so the good news is most things that are contradictory are all partially true. Will your organization survive if you lose someone? Most organizations will. Some organizations are so vulnerable to specialized skills or a network of relationships that they go under if certain people left. On the other hand, there are large companies, multi-billion-dollar companies that lose some key people who had some unique sets of skills. And it is really like losing LeBron James. It is that kind of unique set of skills, and things drop. And I've seen organizations that lose about $200 million a year when they switch leaders because they get somebody that just doesn't have the leadership skills. And over a 3-year period of time, their sales drop. And so there's a lot of truth in it both ways. And the point of it is, it takes 7 years for what's called tacit knowledge, the knowledge that gets picked up outside of what you can pass along in a manual, just the knowledge, the inside knowledge of situations, the inside knowledge of your own organization, the inside knowledge of the customers you're working with. And that's what you can't pass on, and that's what takes 7 years to build, is what's called tacit knowledge, or the inside track, the historical patterns, the knowing what to do. That's the part that's hard to transfer, and that's the part that organizations aren't transferring well. And if you can't keep your millennials, you're not going to transfer it well.
And if you this is probably an example that's going to be different from a lot of people's professions, right? But I've done a lot of work in PR. Part of the reason I've been able to be successful in that is because I just have this gut knowledge I haven't even written down on like how I do things. Like, I've been able to place, stories in, that have made it to CNN and Sports Illustrated. And I know that that's a different message than what I need to say to ABC in Chicago to get a morning show TV interview. Right. And if you ask me how I know how to do that, like subconsciously, I figured out what each one of them are looking for, and I know who to talk to. Right. And it's not like I can do it every time. And, I'm running my own company, so it's like I can do it. Right. But as I look at, like, I can't do everything forever all the time and grow the company. Right. How do I transfer that knowledge into like somebody else who could start to learn that?
Sir, you have put it exactly. That is you've expressed precisely what organizations are struggling with. How do I take what my best performers have in their gut and translate it into something that other people can learn?
Yeah, because I really can't tell you, like, if you asked me to write a manual right now, you said, I'm gonna flip you $5,000 by Monday. Tell me, okay, fine. Maybe that my knowledge is worth more than that. For $50,000 by Monday, have a 5-page outline for me for how you had been successful in PR. I don't know if I can just write it down right now.
No, you couldn't, because most of the people who are really good just know what to go back to sports, know what to do when they have the ball in their hand, but they can't explain it as well. Michael Jordan was not a good teacher. When he was trying to help coach out there with the Wizards, he had actually got on the floor and started playing because he didn't know how to explain what he did. So then he tried to show him, and then he just went, all right, let me just play. Because the people who know what to do can't break it down and explain it. You literally have to find somebody else to break it down. Those people can have other people pull it from them, but they can't do it. It's one of the reasons why sports teams pay for sports psychologists, because when they get stuck, they can't break it down and figure out what to do to get unstuck. It makes those people especially valuable because they know how to pull it out of highly effective, highly successful people's heads and help them unravel what's getting in the way now. And so bottom line of it is, if somebody said to you, let's say you're working in a company, because nobody's going to, you're not going to give yourself a $5,000 bonus to write your own manual. But let's say somebody said to you, all right, I'll give you $5,000 bonus to put everything you know down on paper. You would have to take $3,000 of that and go hire somebody to ask you the right questions and help you write it up in a way that would translate it for somebody else, because you couldn't even explain it well, because mere mortals would stare back and go, so go back over it again. What would you say to CNN versus a local radio station? And you would go, seriously, I've already explained this 3 times. I know, but how would you know the difference here? And then you would get a little line between your eyebrows, and then you'd have homicidal fantasies, and you would want to kill your coworkers.
And one of the points of this podcast is you to not want to kill your coworkers. Right,
and that's the goal we're trying to avoid. And so when companies ask people who just know to do knowledge transfer, they're actually inviting them to have homicidal fantasies, because when they do write it down, mere mortals don't understand it. And then they get really frustrated because they're like, how stupid are you? And then like Michael Jordan, they're out playing rather than coaching because they just get so frustrated when the rest of us can't pick it up quickly enough.
Okay, so let's solve this problem, and then this podcast is going to be a great example of work-life balance, because we're going to have to finish up the last 3 after the interview of episode 2, because I live in Wisconsin, and summer is like 6 hours long here. I mean, fall actually happens at 7 p.m. tonight. So get into like, you took us to the place of despair. I'm like, oh my gosh, now what do I do? Like, am I just dead? How do you do knowledge transfer?
Seth, it really is pretty easy, and I kind of gave the answer in that illustration. You find your best performing folks, and you stop asking them to write it down because they can't, and what they write down is inactionable by most other people.
Okay, and you also can't have them just randomly talk to people, or they're going to get frustrated. So where's the solution?
You bet. So you have people who help extract that information from them and then translate it for average people. Now, some organizations do that well, and other organizations do not. And then you have the best folks give stories that other people can learn from. The best folks need to tell stories of how I landed this deal, and then somebody else pulls the principles from those stories, and they get turned into tacit knowledge. Because tacit knowledge is, how did you know to do that instead of that? That, my friend, is the secret sauce of passing on knowledge. And it usually, in the olden days, it happened by putting one person with another person, experienced salesperson, junior salesperson, and they'd work that same large account for 2 years until the junior salesperson knew all of those. How did you know to do that?
Okay. So it's actually not as terrifying as...
It's not as terrifying at all. It is updating the fact that most companies aren't going to pay to have, for 2 years, to have the same 2 different salespeople on one account. They're just not, they don't have the cost models to do that anymore. And so as a result, the old systems are broken, and we need to translate what works into new organizational structure with thinner ranks of employees, and to speed up the process. Plus, younger generations are FAQ folks. They really do want to see more in writing and more in video. They really do glaze over when the old guy starts telling grasshopper stories. Okay, Kung Fu, let me tell you, grasshopper. And then they're like, shut up, old man, get to the point. At least that's the look you give me.
You know, I don't think that's true. You know, and if I can just add this maybe small note, as somebody who's worked in a lot of different kinds of organizations, especially if you have a larger organization, you need to be thinking about doing a podcast and a video series as an intranet. Like, seriously.
Yes, like seriously.
Seriously. Get your CEO, get your top people, get your smartest people that, you know, every organization's got somebody that they can walk into the room and every employee knows, I'm going to leave feeling like I can do this, feeling better about my job. My gosh, package that. Give it to them on email every week. It costs you nothing. You know, one of the ways I was able to grow my the podcast I do on my own to 20,000 listens in the first 10 weeks is I actually do like cell phone videos while driving, which you check your local laws. But I just put cell phone on the dash of my car. I hit record. I drive down the interstate. I talk about something for 10 minutes. I upload it when I get to Wi-Fi. It costs leaders so little to do a 10-minute off-the-cuff video where they just pass down wisdom, pass down tactics, pass down knowledge, and you can deliver that for free. It is so dang easy.
Well, Seth, I just, to talk the other side of that, you just said off the cuff. And that's what freaks out companies. Because when the CEO, what freaks out what freaks out the entire administration is when Donald Trump tweets and they don't know what he's tweeted until they see it when everybody else does. And so it's the off the cuff stuff that freaks out large companies, because many CEOs have caused real waves of challenge for managers by saying something off the cuff that gets interpreted in some different ways. So most executive communications are so handled and so screened. I've worked with senior executives who are very compelling, but when they speak, they've been so scripted that they basically look like automatons, soulless automatons, and it's because of that scripting process. So to be fair, we need a lot more informal, but we also need the ability to edit out the times they say stuff they shouldn't say. And that's really the secret sauce, my friend. They go live, they talk, they've got their talking points, and then somebody very cheaply, it is not very expensive, goes through and edits like other podcasters do when they lose it, and they edit it out so they don't lose their audience. It's the exact same thing. It's just most people in internal communications haven't worked outside, and most executives and most leadership teams and most legal offices are really freaked out at the thought the executive may get recorded saying things.
We're going to go ahead and wrap it up there. Episode number 2, we're going to go ahead and jump back in a week from today. Probably a little bit more structure here, but
I hope not, but keep going.
You hope not. So the recap here is you got to learn to talk to the different generations like they want to be talked to. If you're a leader, you can be doing a lot more probably to talk to your employees right where they're at, maybe with your cell phone between meetings. And the third thing is, if you have like a rock in your stomach right now, you probably need to fire somebody within the next 48 hours or how long ever it takes you to get it worked out with HR.
Talk to HR, fill your paperwork out, and then deal with the rock in your stomach. But yes, I agree in principle with what Seth is saying.
And if you're doing our reverse fantasy draft of your 10 worst employees, for goodness sakes, do mind the whiteboard that it gets fully erased and doesn't have the outline left there.